NTV Television Network presents The Other Day, Current Era, 1963. Translation and voiceover by BMI Russian. Good evening. You're watching episode 3 of our series The Other Day, 1961 to 1991. Events, people, and occurrences which defined a lifestyle. Things we can't imagine ourselves without, let alone comprehend. Another year, another episode. Today we'll be covering the year 1963. The Friendship oil pipeline, Lev Yashin, Tereshkova's flight, the Kennedy assassination, Oren Grain, the twist dance, Petrosyan's championship victory, and Bologna cloaks. Commenting in today's episode, we have screenwriter and actress Renata Litvinova, economic expert Yegor Gaidar, and writer Anatoly Streliny. The country's most popular game show, which debuted 2 years prior, was called KVN, or Club of the Funny and Inventive. In '63, the club found 2 regular hosts, in the form of a model young man and an exemplary young lady, Sasha Maslякov and Sveta Zhiltsova. Them being art theater alumni, they were effectively transferred to the Student Cultural Center from the Treasure House of National Culture. Good evening, dear comrades! Good evening to fans of our Club of the Funny and Inventive. The long-awaited day is finally upon us. KVN was all about amateur drama, improvisation, and cheekiness, which was all highly valued at the time. The entire country played along with KVN, mimicking the good golden youth. Spring and summer of 1963 was when the civil rights movement in the U.S. went full steam. This led President Kennedy to submit a Civil Rights Act for Congress's consideration. The Attorney General received the right to prosecute public schools if they refused to enroll people of color. Segregation in restaurants, hotels, movie theaters, and other public spaces was outlawed. Now, this almost led to an all-out war breaking out in the traditionally racist southern states, with Alabama leading the charge when it came to racially motivated acts of terror. The black movement was spearheaded by a Baptist preacher named Martin Luther King. In Birmingham, which was Alabama's largest city, King would draw thousands of people out onto the streets and hold meetings at the church, demanding equal rights at schools and acceptance of black applicants to universities. The police retaliated with water cannons, tear gas. They would sick dogs on people. Alabama Governor Wallace got the state National Guard involved and promised to personally throw out any black man who so much as entered the university. President Kennedy then transferred control of the local National Guard to Secretary of Defense McNamara, ordering him in the meantime to guarantee black applicants proper education. The university's territory was then occupied by troops, who forced out Wallace and arrested 15 white people who came there with chains and other weapons. 2 days before the start of the new academic year, King organizes his legendary March on Washington. The march was attended by 200,000 people from all 50 U.S. states. Next to the Lincoln Memorial, King delivers his most well-known speech, which went, "I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood." The words "I have a dream" became the motto for the civil rights movement. That turbulent summer of 1963 actually produced a joking counter-argument in the Soviet Union, along the lines of, in response to any US criticism, we can simply say, "But you guys beat up black people." June 16, 1963 was the first ever time a woman went to space. Valentina Tereshkova, while aboard the Vostok 6 spacecraft, traveled around the Earth 49 times. Former weaver and Komsomol organizer from Yaroslavl, she was into parachuting, joined the cosmonaut squad. Her call sign in orbit was Chaika, or Seagull, a brilliant background for a Soviet citizen. In November of 1963, that era's most famous wedding was held. The first female cosmonaut was getting married to the third male cosmonaut, Squad Commander Andrei Nikolaev. Inside the wedding palace on Griboyedova Street, Falcon escorted Seagull to the table, where she for the very first time drew out her new surname, Nikolaeva Tereshkova. 300 guests were present at the Lenin Hills-based government reception house. They all wished the newlyweds a happy family orbit. Later on, though, the cosmic marriage did fall apart, and Nikolaeva Tereshkova again became simply Tereshkova. The friendship oil pipeline reaches the USSR's western border. The Soviet and Polish sides of the pipeline were joined. The final seam was welded up on the border of Brest and Belostok provinces. Out of all European socialist countries, Romania was the only one with its own crude oil reserves. Friendship used to be, and still is, a commonly known name for an oil pipeline. Just like the Volga River or the birch tree, the friendship oil pipeline is right up there. It's worth noting that it illustrates the widespread notion that all socialist countries used to be dependent on our energy resources. As in, we sent them crude oil at no cost, based on our friendship, which slipped away from us through a pipeline. The Soviet Empire was a rather strange phenomenon in the history of the world's economy. Typically, it was the center which would establish a resource base within its colonies. But in this case, the center itself, as in the USSR, was in fact the resource base for its Eastern European colonies. All sides were, of course, intricately connected. I mean, these colonies could have never gotten by without raw material support from the Soviet Union. However, these tight connections did come at a hefty cost. In the 1960s, about twice as much Soviet crude oil was supplied to Eastern Europe than was offered in exchange for hard foreign currency. Back then, Nikita Sergeyevich was the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine. 1963 was the year when Soviet twist was born. It came about just as the masses were being introduced to popular foreign varieties, which traced their roots to 1960s twist made by Chubby Checker. Government officials deemed lower body movements to be obscene, while performing the dance itself was considered akin to worshipping the Western world, though in the end nobody was seriously punished. By that time, too many people in the USSR were doing the twist. People could safely do the twist right until they committed a more serious crime. However, if somebody's personal file were to be opened, their passion for twist could have been used to tar the reputation of the person subject to investigation. Soviet composers actually used twist motifs in their work without any grave consequences. Pioneers included Arno Babajanyan with his Queen of Beauty and Best City in the World, and Yuri Saulsky with his song Black Cat. During the space era, atheism begins to mock the relics of olden times. Is there any room for religion when all you see is satellites and construction? Gagarin was in space, he didn't see God there. Cartoonists had a serious aptitude towards discrediting clergymen, and to a certain extent even propagating temptations. Atheism, which was coming to the forefront, insisted that an earthly life is much more attractive, with its secular, or rather Soviet rituals being very festive and magnificent. Soviet weddings, which were held in a registration office underneath a crest, complement Soviet christening, or registering a newborn in a baby palace. Instead of a cross, an urbanite medal is issued. The spread of these progressive practices emanated from Leningrad. A newborn is no longer registered under God, but instead, for example, under Chelyabinsk. In 1963, a certain truth became apparent, which bears relevance to this very day. Lev Yashin is the best soccer goalie in all of history. October 23rd, the game of the century was taking place at Wembley Stadium in London between Team World and Team England to commemorate the centennial of football. Yashin was brilliant as the goalkeeper for Team World. 1 month later, he puts on one of his best performances ever, in Rome against Italy's national team. Yashin deflects a penalty shot and a couple of bombs from close proximity. That year's Soviet championship ended with Yashin claiming an unprecedented record for impervious goalkeeping, with him failing to deflect just 6 balls in a total of 27 games. That same year, Yashin was awarded a Golden Ball, a prize reserved only for Europe's best soccer players. There weren't enough workers around to aid in constructing multiple chemical plants. Prisoner labor had to be used. The phrase "sent to chemistry" was added to the prison vernacular. The recently built nitrogen fertilizer wing at Tula province-based Novomoskovsk chemical plant is quickly gaining momentum. Similar giant chemical plants will soon be erected in several of our country's republics. New industrial technologies and materials. New technologies and new harvests in agriculture. New knowledge, new personnel, and new working environments. And a new lifestyle. For example, dry cleaning starts to become a thing. In 1963, Fidel Castro visits the Soviet Union for the first time. Over a period of 1.5 months, he visits all of the country's main cities, enjoying a warm welcome wherever he went. As for the two highlights of his extra-long visit, first we have the Soviet-Cuban friendship meeting at the Red Square. Second, granting Fidel the title of Hero of the Soviet Union.
La Unión Soviética.
Long live the Soviet Union!
Patria o muerte.
Fatherland or death.
Venceremos.
We will prevail. While in the USSR, Castro declares Cuba a socialist bloc country. Direct flights commenced between Moscow and Havana, and Castro's title of hero was the peak of the romance between the Soviet Union and Cuba. Across seas and oceans, people were striving for a new life. They overthrew a hated dictator, shut down the counter-revolutionary movement, and now everybody was busy collecting sugarcane together under Fidel. Instead of boring bureaucrats, their party members were inspired young lads, who swore to never shave until victory was theirs. They didn't afterwards either. That's young socialist blood for you. Reclaiming ideals is worth more than attaining them. All of this was encapsulated in an enthusiastic motto uttered in one spirit: Cuba, my love!
Cuba, любовь моя, остров зари багровой, песня летит над планетой звеня. Cuba, любовь моя.
In 1963, the Okhta chemical plant in Leningrad and the Salavat plant in Bashkiria began mass production of Soviet polyethylene. In cable production, polyethylene was used as an insulator. As for so-called food-grade polyethylene, it was used for making bottle corks and tableware. Polyethylene handbags appeared, which were more often referred to as cellophane bags. They weren't particularly cheap, but they were thick and durable. Therefore, they were typically considered reusable. Right up until the Soviet Union's collapse, people would wash polyethylene bags, dry them, and use them again. Starting in 1963, the notion that every self-respecting person must have a Bologna cloak starts to gain popularity. This was a raincoat that leaked at the seams and at the same time acted as a greenhouse regardless of the weather. The first dark blue Bologna cloaks appeared 1 year prior. In Italy, this material was initially used for making work clothes. When folded, this cloak barely took up any space, which only helped in spreading the fashion trend. The crew of every ship returning from an international trip would bring hundreds of these cloaks with them. The price? 60 to 80 rubles apiece. During an age when these Bolognas were all the rage, this was an astronomical price tag.
Bologna cloaks were the herald of unisex-style clothing, since these cloaks were cut similarly for women and men, and they would pretty much completely mask one's body shape. In Russia, Bologna cloaks made gabardine trench coats obsolete, while establishing the term summer trench coat, which for the entire world was something completely unimaginable.
1963 marked the end of Mikhail Botvinnik's time as chess champion, with Tigran Petrosyan claiming the 9th world chess title. Rematches were no longer a thing, but previously Botvinnik was able to reclaim his title twice when up against Smyslov and Tal. The duel between Botvinnik and Petrosyan went on for almost 2 months. The commentators would indifferently note that, regardless of the outcome, victory would go to the Soviet school of chess. In the entire history of chess championships, Petrosyan is the 9th ever person to be honored as world champion. Composer Arkady Ostrovsky writes 3 songs based on Lev Yashin's poetry, a series called Meanwhile in Our Yard. Yards during the 60s were nice and pleasant, unlike the 40s where there was a lot of hooliganism. This is where one's soul would shine. We have a girl who lives in the neighborhood. Meanwhile, it's either raining or snowing outside. Accompanied by the words, "In our yard," they play the same record until nightfall, as well as "There it is again," that record playing in our yard.
Нам пластинка поет и проститься с тобой все никак не дает. В туфлях на гвоздиках, в тоненьком свитере, глупая, все тебя мучает одно. Как бы подружки твои не увидели, да старики, что стучат в домино.
On June 14, 1963, China's Communist Party's Central Committee sends a letter to the Soviet Union's Central Committee. After a series of failed negotiations between parties, exactly 1 month later, on the 14th of July, China's complaints are published in Pravda, along with the Soviet Union's public response. Despite the recipients still being listed as our Chinese comrades, it was quite obvious that our friendship was over. Who would have thought that Russians and Chinese weren't brothers for life? On the topic of thermonuclear war, China's letter said, "The victorious nations will swiftly build upon the ruins of vanquished imperialism a civilization 1,000 times greater than anything under capitalism." The Soviet letter responds, "Did they even speak with the working class in the countries where imperialism still reigns? Atomic bombs can't tell the difference between an imperialist and a worker." Our Central Committee criticized China's rulers for their motto, which lacked any class substance, which read, "The wind from the east overrules the wind from the west." Meanwhile, China criticized the USSR for a lack of proletarian dictatorship, as well as the communist parties of France and Italy for parliamentary cretinism. The Soviet letter mentioned Mao Zedong's personality cult for the first time. A battle was underway to determine who would lead the communist movement. China declared the CPSU to be a revisionist party, and themselves to be the only true loyal successors of Marxism. For the first time ever in 1963, China insists on re-evaluating its border with the USSR near the Amur and Ussuri rivers. Stop with your farming. Grab a rifle. Using this road, the dark Soviet revisionists will come to kill you from 1,000 kilometers away. In 1963, the role of jury chairman for the 3rd Moscow International Film Festival was assigned to film director Grigory Chukhrai, who won the previous festival with his movie Clear Skies. Under his guidance, the jury makes a bold decision. Instead of having 2 first-place winners, they gave the prize entirely to Federico Fellini's movie 8½, though there was an attempt to have Fellini's work share the prize with a film about a foreman called Meet Baluyev. Fellini's burlesque, which left the jury in awe, was considered by the top dogs in the film committee to be uninspired formalism. They showed the film to Khrushchev, who fell asleep during screening, and therefore didn't get angry, despite expectations. The winner received his prize. 8½ is the most significant movie production that ever received first place at the Moscow Film Festival. The Russia movie theater was built specifically with festivals in mind. Despite it being the largest in the USSR, it still couldn't help with that time's movie deficit. People would spend hours in line to buy tickets. Either that or they'd source an extra ticket or get them from scalpers. Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev bestows a gold star medal upon Tadar Zhivkov. Academician Trofim Lysenko was chairman of the Academy of Agriculture when genetics was considered imperialism's corrupt broad. Later on, Lysenko initiated the planting of forest belts, which to this day stand as a green monument to him in the south. In 1963, Lysenko becomes head of an experimental farm in Gorky-Leninskye. While there, Lysenko implements the last of his sensational campaigns, specifically the square nest method for sowing tilled crops such as corn and peas. Weeds were declared to be the greatest threat to corn and peas, and by extension to abundance of produce in general. And there weren't enough chemicals available to combat them. Lysenko suggested treating the fields twice, down and across. This square method might have led to a decrease in the amount of weeds, but this also meant that the tractors had to carry out twice as much work and waste twice the amount of time and fuel. The seeds also had to be sown with incredible precision. All in all, Lysenko's method was just about as effective as his idea to feed cocoa to cows in order to increase fat percentage in milk. Not only elder people were dyeing their hair to hide the gray, but youngsters as well. Not only ladies, but guys too. The fashion-minded crowd was no longer interested in natural hair color, it being too simple. As for the main types of trendy hairstyles, if you mix henna and basma in the right proportion, you get various tones of chestnut color, though more often you'd get a dark orange. Doubling down on the basma is how you get a hot brunette look happening. If you boil onion peel and use that to get a brighter color, you end up with canary yellow. The most extreme method for attaining a bright white hair color requires using chemical compounds which are somewhat hazardous to your health. Some people criticized contemporary fashion, saying that hair colored using peroxide always looks untamed. Women with that sort of hair were labeled as peroxide blondes. Mature dames with blue hair became a common sight back then. They would pour a bowl of blued water onto their heads after bathing. Even ink was used to get a more intense blue color. Young guys with light brown hair would occasionally dye their hair chestnut color, but more often they'd opt for black. Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev bestows a gold star medal upon Tadar Zhivkov. Nikita Khrushchev spends the velvet days of 1963 in Yugoslavia. This happened 10 years after the last caricatures were drawn of gangsters Tito and Rankovic, who were elbow-deep in the blood of the Yugoslavian people. Khrushchev flew into Belgrade together with his wife Nina Petrovna. They were greeted by President Tito and his wife Jovanka, and Vice President Rankovic and his wife Slavka. This was considered an informal visit. And this was testament to the fact that Yugoslavia was again considered a brotherly nation. Khrushchev explained that, "We argue with our Yugoslavian comrades about their background, but regardless, they are socialists, in their own peculiar way." Speaking in Soviet terms, Yugoslavian socialism was of the NEP variety. When Western journalists asked President Tito on whether Yugoslavia will now officially join the socialist bloc, he answered, being one of the founders of the non-aligned movement, that the matter hadn't been taken into consideration. Both sides were united in their outlook on the most critical issues of that time. Soviet citizens started visiting Yugoslavia as tourists, though they would be registered as if they were visiting a capitalist country. On September 1st, 1963, Soviet students went to school wearing a new uniform. Instead of a shirt with a mandarin collar, a wide belt, and a peak cap, they would now wear gray cloth jackets. The previous uniform came about during the Stalin era, when everybody from a miner to a diplomat was wearing a full dress uniform. Replacing those with civilian jackets stirred some controversy. People started questioning the need for a school uniform. Ultimately, it was deemed necessary, so that nobody stood out. Girls had it easier, though their garments were fit for nuns or waitresses, since they could use their hairstyle or manicure to be different, or they could just trim their brown dresses, turning them into miniskirts. In 1963, for the first time since the desolation of the post-revolution years, the Soviet Union purchases grain from another country. Verbal political propaganda tried to present this under the guise of rational economic policy, as in the grain was meant for the Far East regions, which are easier to reach via the Pacific Ocean than by land across our vast territory. though they wouldn't write the same thing in the papers. These were obviously labeled as temporary measures. In 1963, the USSR purchased 3.1 million tons of grain from the US and Canada. In 1964, that number grew to 7.3 million tons. Baked bread was cheap, and collective farmers would feed it to cows. I remember telling my mother, "What are you doing? This is bread after all." She answered, "Of course, and the farm animals know it too. Look at how much they like it." They actually didn't feed bread to animals in the collective farms. They fed them with grain. And in terms of the science, their approach was all wrong. So you got more manure from these animals than meat or milk. Tens of millions of tons of grain were basically turned into manure this way. So they had to import tens of millions of tons from other countries. From across the ocean, no less. The fact that this undermined people's faith in socialism, buying so much grain from overseas was humiliating for Russia. Not for the Soviet Union, mind you, but specifically for Russia. After some time, you could even discuss the matter on television, albeit carefully. Anyway, all of these talks boiled down to us needing to produce more of our own grain, more than we were producing already. One moron scientist went so far as to claim that we need no less than 1 ton per capita. That number was even included in the plan for building communism. Meanwhile, nobody asked that guy how some of the wealthier nations were able to make do with half a ton, cover all of their needs, and have enough left to sell to us. In 1963, Yunost magazine publishes a lithograph of the same name by Stasys Krasauskas, the girl with the hair of willow branches. The picture became the magazine's logo, while the magazine itself became the symbol of the most numerous generation in the history of Russia, of those born in the first years after World War II. The magazine's new editor-in-chief, Boris Polivoy, introduces Yevgeny Yevtushenko and Vasily Aksionov to the editorial board. Aksionov's tale Oranges from Morocco is published in Yunost, with illustrations by Krasauskas. Anatoly Gladilin's First Day of the New Year is also published, as well as Robert Rojdestvinsky's Letter to the 30th Century. This piece's protagonist loves the words "it's normal" and looks at everything in life through squinted eyes. To this day, John Kennedy remains the youngest ever U.S. president. He was 44 years old when he took 70-year-old Dwight Eisenhower's place in office. 3 years after winning the first election and 1 year before he surely would have repeated his victory, on November 22, 1963, John Kennedy was murdered in Texas's capital city, Dallas. The U.S. Senate committee came to the conclusion that the United States' 35th president was shot down from a nearby school textbook warehouse by former Marine Lee Harvey Oswald, who in turn was shot during the investigation by nightclub owner Jack Ruby, who himself died from cancer in his jail cell 1 month later. During the funeral at the Arlington Cemetery in Washington, Mikoyan was present on behalf of the Soviet Union, though nobody would have been surprised if Khrushchev himself had flown to America. Officially, we were in tense relations, but in fact it was a love-hate relationship. For the first time ever, our central television aired a live broadcast from the USA. The state funeral of President Kennedy was relayed through America's Telestar satellite. Aside from the outrage on account of what the hell is going on in the USA, there was a different sentiment going around. Kennedy was considered one of the only secular heroes in the USSR, a handsome and rich young man with a gorgeous wife, head of a great country. They murdered one of the luckiest people alive. A bunch of guides for new settlers appeared, which shaped the foundations for minimalistic living environments, or furnishing apartments as they wrote back then. Minimalism superseded the harsh neoclassicism of the 1940s and 1950s. Some shelves, a couch, a table, and an armchair on spread legs. Rooms had to have more space and no frills, according to experts. Living arrangements with just what you need was part of the effort to eliminate hoarding. Keep it simple. Substitute paintings with prints, crystal with glass, porcelain with ceramics, ficus with spiderwort, velvet drapes with linen curtains. Former Pyatnitsky choir soloist Lyudmila Zykina successfully pursues her solo career. In 1963, she is awarded the title Honored Artist of the RSFSR. Her first claims to fame were songs about everyday life such as Orenburg Downy Shawl, Mother Dear Mother I Love You So Much, and A Young Sailor Coming Home on Leave.
Отчего у нас в поселке у девчат переполох? Кто их поднял с позаранок, кто их так встревожить мог? На побывку едет молодой моряк, грудь его в медалях, ленты в якорях.
While the hunters were loading their rifles, we just went through 1963 in another episode of The Other Day, 1961 to 1991, current era. Next time we'll be covering 1964, when La Scala came to Moscow, collective farmers received pensions, Khrushchev was removed, the Aswan Dam was finished, Walking the Streets of Moscow came out, and the Kirovets 700 tractor debuted. See you next episode and next year. Farewell!